thank you for that very warm introduction, and of course, thank you for the opportunity to be out here today. It's incredible that this event has been in place for 7 years and continues to grow and continues to tackle different topics in the best way possible, by bringing together all types of providers and community groups. Just to give a little more background about ASSA, because it might be relevant about some of the things we talk about. It is as was said in the introduction, it is an organization, these highly specialized schools. It was founded in 1974, so we're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And this is worth thinking about when we come to the topic that we're going to talk about today, is whether an out-of-district placement is right for a student or your child. And that goes in two ways. One, is it right from the perspective of navigating the federal legal process with your school district, but also whether or not it's right from the perspective of whether it makes sense for your child from just trying to figure out what's best for them as a parent. And we'll talk about both those lenses, because I think it's important to consider both those. And so with that in mind, ASSA does a lot of different things. One of them is this partnership with families, doing things like we're doing today, coming out to both either table at events, provide information, provide substantive knowledge. It's also worth noting we have a free parents assistance line, and we're a 501c3 that's dedicated to supporting students with special needs and their families. So they assist far beyond out-of-district placements. It's truly any child that needs some help navigating the IEP process, or working the 504 process or something. So we will call our main line, and there's an extension for our parent assistance line services, and our parent advocate gets back very promptly. And so it's worth noting when we start thinking about the broad spectrum of placements for students. As you heard a little bit in the last presentation, you're really looking at the individual child, the individual student, what they need. Some of that could be providing additional resources in their existing public school placement, whole variety of resources that could involve, from accommodations to things like help from testing to one-to-one aids, even advanced duty nurses if there's a medical issue. Sometimes there can be a consideration of perhaps sending to another public school district. So if a neighboring district has a vibrant autism program, perhaps the decision would be to send to that district. Counties will set up public options, either sometimes called county special service districts or ed service commissions or jointures. And then beyond that tier, that's where the idea of private schools are in the state. We have kind of two types. There's actually what the state calls approved private schools for students with disabilities, and it's important to recognize those are state-approved schools. They meet a very rigorous standard to get that approval and that accreditation, and they are governed by a very strict set of regulations, both that govern in terms of program reviews, making sure there's compliance and using the best educational practices. If you're in an approved school, every staff member has the same certifications that would be required in any of those public placements. And similarly, they're very accountable for every dollar they spend to ensure that they're being done to improve the educational and support outcomes of students. But federal law also requires that the best option be available for students. So if that isn't even an approved private school for students with disabilities, there is something known as the Naples Act that allows consideration of unapproved schools if they have something to offer, if it's that highly specialized in nature. And then even beyond that, out-of-state placements and things. So really, this gets into when you heard a little bit about this concept of IDEA and how every student is allowed to have is required to have a free, appropriate public education. It's important to recognize that public in that sense means publicly provided. So, and I think that probably the first thing that parents need to know is that there are options, and that this is an option if it's appropriate for children. And sometimes that's a big battle on two levels. One, making sure that there's a comfort on the side of the parent and the family to think about whether it makes sense to broach that topic as part of your, as part of a participant in a child study team. And on the other hand, it's also thinking about how to make the case to the school district, and ideally in a collaborative process. But when good faith disagreements happen, sometimes that requires other types of advocacy, whether just a student or a parent advocate or perhaps attorneys. But again, the important thing is that every student in this country has a right to a free and appropriate public education. And so that's probably the biggest takeaway here, is that part of getting that education is a consideration of all of those options. So that's where it's worth recognizing that both ASSA and approved private schools for students with disabilities really take pride in their partnership with schools. Like, the student educated in an out-of-district placement is a public school student. They remain the responsibility of their sending district, and they're only being sent because they're not able to appropriately provide for the educational and other needs of that child. But it is ultimately a partnership. And so that's important to recognize. And similarly, we take accountability for outcomes very seriously. And I think it's also important to recognize that, so a big piece to remember is, despite being referred to sometimes as, when you think about private school, they're available at no cost to parents. That's often a big lack of consideration, is this idea that somehow parents would have to pay. And that even generally includes transportation as well. So those are big misnomers. A lot of times, particularly individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, they hear the word private and they don't want to actually consider the option, because they go, oh, I don't have the resources to pay for a private school. And that's part of the reason why, even in our own internal messaging, we try our best not to just refer to them as private schools. So they really aren't. They are ultimately state-approved specialized schools. Sometimes I'll say that they're privately run. They're privately run providers of public education, because again, that is what they're doing. They're providing that federal mandate to public education. And so I guess with that, I'm going to just try to talk through a few things really worth considering in that option, just re-emphasizing. So of course, one of your options are out-of-district placements. And I do continue to mean the whole gamut, right? Again, that could be another public school district, like the school district down the road. That could be some kind of county arranged public education option. That could be an APSSD. So that's mostly what I'm most familiar with, but that's also approved private school for students with disabilities, or a school that's an able school or an out-of-state placement, right? So this is how it's defined in state law and state regulation. It's an approved private school for students with disabilities. And as I've alluded to, there's a lot of problems with that name. And we're actually contemplating whether or not the Law Revision Commission should really look at a different name for that and trying to advocate for that. And part of the challenge is, I think, again, people, especially when it's in statutes and it's not capitalized, people don't think that we're a bucket of regulated schools. Like, you think about traditional public schools, and there's traditional public schools and charter schools and Renaissance schools. They all have to meet certain rules. APSSDs are more comparable to that. They have to get a state approval. All their budgets are tightly regulated. But if you look at that as a sentence of words that are lowercase, and I know it's kind of a funny point, but I guess we are in a library and no words matter, and the way things are presented matters. Whenever I send an email or write a document, I capitalize all 5 of those letters, because it is a proper noun. They are approved private schools for students with disabilities. But if you saw that as a lowercase sentence, and this is half of my challenge on the advocacy side, they think it's just private schools that just happen to be approved on a case-by-case basis. And I think that that's another battle too, is so often, both from a lack of information provided to parents and often because of some poor philosophies in traditional public schools, if a student is actually referred out earlier in life, the likelihood that they'll return to the public school with or without supports is very great. So I think we kind of intuitively know that, but the evidence backs it up, that the earlier the intervention, the better. I mean, we do an annual outcome study that shows that fact, because we fight that misconception a lot, both with parents and also with school districts. There's a lot of school districts that philosophically think it's better for a younger child to stay in their school until they become so much of a problem in their minds, not my word, that they need to be referred out. But really, it'd be the opposite, that if you were to get that child what they needed when they were younger and could actually respond to the interventions in the education, they're very likely to come back to their school district. And I actually could give you a copy of our outcome study after this presentation that you could look at, and publish that online as well. That's something, as you can imagine, that's on the top of all of our minds. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing that every student's different. So depending on the level of their needs and severity, there are some students who do, regardless of when they end up in a out-of-district placement, they might graduate out of it. And that might be the right thing for them. Something, depending if we get to it or not, we're going to talk a little bit about myths about least restrictive environment. But and that's a legal term, of course. But one, it's important to remember that should always be evaluated on the individual student. It's not some concept. We kind of think that the word environment is probably problematic. It really should be least restrictive experience. Because at the end of the day, if your student remains in what might be termed a mainstream environment, but spends every day in a resource room and isn't able to participate in school activities, that's not a beneficial arrangement. And what happens in a lot of these out-of-district placements is the experience. When I took on this role, and I'm still in the process of trying to get out and tour every single one of my members, but it feels like a school in almost every instance. There's, of course, some schools that require such a level of intervention, it might not feel like traditional public school. For the most part, they feel like a school. And why do they feel like a school? Because it is a school. You have teachers teaching subject matters. You have sometimes just depending on the age of sometimes students changing classes, switching classes, sometimes push-in activities. A lot of times the opportunity to participate in athletics in an actual way, not as a support role, but really playing the sport, perhaps serving on a student council. So in some ways, there's this misnomer that by going out of district, you're going to have somehow a less full experience. But depending on the philosophy and the resources of the public school, that might be farther from the truth than you could imagine, right? So that's why if you think it's an option, again, it really needs to be considered holistically. And that's why, if you were to bring that up with your child's study team, you would go out and see the school. And these are the kind of questions that you'd ask. Our website actually has a checklist of things that you should ask and think about and consider. A lot of schools even, when we think about the concept of mainstreaming, a lot of our schools also try to participate with area schools and have other opportunities as well, if that's a concern. But, similarly, sometimes sometimes you talk to some teachers in these schools that say, and they're just being candid, but they say that I have a student who came up to me that it's like, I'm so happy in the school because this is the first time I felt like my teacher liked me. Again, that's not in every situation, but it's, sometimes the sense of actually being able to feel like you're belonging can be more powerful than perhaps striving for an ideal that works in, say, 95% of the cases. And I think that that's probably the biggest takeaway here is that every student's need really is individualized. And it's, and how do we get there? We get there by understanding what you want for your child. We get there by understanding what the child wants for themselves, depending on their age, of course, and then what the experts do in their evaluations. There's a lot of myths about placement in the least restrictive environment. And I think the first one we alluded to, but it's just worth simply saying, like, LRE is not simply a matter of keeping students in local schools. There are probably some advocacy groups in the state that would look at it that way. And that's because we have a bad tendency to prefer quantitative data over qualitative data when they should be used in conjunction. And if you frankly just look at numbers, you would make the argument, if you're just purely looking at placement data, you would say that you would argue that perhaps New Jersey doesn't have its students in the least restrictive environment, but ultimately that's a flawed analysis in part because if New Jersey is a state that has the best options for students, people choose to move here and live here and utilize those options. So by comparing us to an under-resourced U.S. state that maybe has more students in traditional public schools, that doesn't necessarily mean those students are getting the best possible education. And I think it's funny, like a good funny example of this is when you go on like Facebook or social media and you see like these, we all love these, there's like these maps and it's like, what's everyone's favorite fast food restaurant or something by state. But it's just ultimately not reliable data. It creates all kinds of skews. So just doing a state-to-state comparison, while it's compelling and sounds good, it's not a good way to think about it. Because again, it's about what's best for the student. And if you hear stories about states that might score well on a metric like that, and then they ultimately get sued in federal court for not doing right by the students they serve. So just be skeptical of that kind of idea, just looking at this quantitatively. And similarly, a private school may be the LRE for all the reasons we said. It's an individualized placement, and ultimately the opportunity to be able to participate in the things that we think about as being a student is what really matters. It's not just this idea of being in a traditional school, because if you're in a traditional school but not truly mainstreamed, that's not a benefit. Like the perceived benefit of being in a public school is the ability to be educated alongside neurotypical peers and participate in activities alongside them. But if that's not in fact happening, why should that get counted as a good point? Why do you put the star on the chart for a least restrictive environment? And that's frankly the way we count data in the state, that we look at it by physical placements. But our students and our children are far more than just the sum of the building that they happen to go and be educated in. And of course, IDEA itself does not require every student to be placed in the regular class. I mean, that's ultimately what we talk about, this idea of a FAPE, or a free and appropriate public education. It really is a determination of all the factors involved. And placements, again, must be individually determined. And that's that combination of child study team that the parents are part of, that specialists are a part of it, the student at the appropriate age is also a part of it. And it's really about what's best for that student. And then, of course, the state's benchmarks are not federal requirements. So just because our state chooses to measure something a particular way, or chooses to score schools in a particular way, that's not the law. Doesn't mean that data isn't valuable. But it becomes an apples and oranges thing. And I think it's very important to recognize that least restrictive environment as a federal law concept is not synonymous with location of where a student's being placed, no matter how many times people might spin it to you. And no matter if you were to sit in a room with a fancy PowerPoint presentation, I could put up bar charts too, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're talking about is accurate. And it's also important too that your county office provides information, but they do not approve placements. So they're not a part of that process. And then obviously separate is separate too. So despite the fact that our funding streams somewhat prioritize alternative public placements versus, say, a private placement, it's not inherently more mainstream to be in a county special service district than it would be to be in an APSSD. And again, it really should be about the quality of what the student is experiencing. And that's why, if we had our way, we would think about least restrictive experience as opposed to environment. And I think that this document puts it really bluntly, and it's well done, is a classroom in a trailer does not make a child feel included. We couldn't say that any more plainly, that merely being in a public school, if your entire day is around individuals like yourself anyway, but in an under-resourced setting, you're not necessarily gaining the benefit of being educated or participating with neurotypical peers or otherwise, non-special needs individuals. And of course, paraprofessional support needs to be carefully considered. And this cuts both ways, but remembering there's values in one-on-ones, right? And sometimes a student being sent to any of these out-district placements may be sent with or without their own one-on-one, or perhaps a nurse or whatever the need is. Similarly, you could be in your traditional public school with one, but that alone isn't a fix, because it doesn't necessarily get you the resources or the involvement that you deserve. And now it could be. Again, it's all about the needs of the child, but what is their actual day-to-day experience? And of course, I think it's great that these numbers lead up to this. Placement is not an outcome. Like, at the end of the day, the state can measure whatever it wants, but at the end of the day, you're concerned about your child, and we're ultimately should be concerned about a student having the most fulfilling life possible, that they can live their life up to their abilities. That if that's that ability to go to college or enter competitive employment or supportive employment, whether that's to live on their own or live in a group home, whatever the best possible outcome for them is, and then their own happiness, of course, the ability to have a hobby, to have otherwise engagements with other human beings. That's what really matters. I mean, when we look back on our own education, we're not really thinking so much about what the particulars of what classroom we were in or what we were being taught. We're thinking about what we were able to do because of that education. So I think that doesn't prejudge the placement. The goal is just really focusing on what you and your heart of hearts believe is going to be the best outcome for your child, and then pursue it, as zealously and as appropriate as possible. And then this is more of a public policy point, but it bears being said. Private special education is not, in fact, more costly than public options. So while I quoted those tuition rates earlier, and they did sound a little eye-popping, this is an actual cost system that includes every cost. So unlike in a public option, where the pension is being covered by the state and the building's being subsidized by the county and the state and schools development authority, that tuition dollar is almost let's say 98% of the cost of actually educating that child. That includes the salaries of the staff that are in fact lower than the salaries that their public counterparts are getting paid. But it includes their salaries, includes their pensions, their health care, it includes facilities improvements. So when you hear that big number, it's big because it's an honest, accurate assessment. If you were quoted the tuition rate, and again, you're not paying any of these as a parent, but it's worth understanding from a public policy perspective. So again, there's a little bit of the difference between what the law is and what actuality is. But students that are properly classified should begin transition planning around the time they're approaching 14. There's sometimes the pre-transition planning that happens before that. And then depending on the type of school, depending on the type of placement, and that's the student population you're serving, that some of them are looking at the whole spectrum of outcome options, right? Depending on what type of need and disability is being addressed there. And some of them, as you can imagine, have partnerships with community businesses. They have in-house training opportunities. A lot of these schools really innovated during the pandemic as well because they had to. I mean, APSSDs were ultimately the first schools in the state that reopened because the populations they served needed it. Mm-hmm. So they were back that September, if not sooner. Whereas a lot, as we know, our traditional public school districts ultimately were closed a lot longer. Having said that, you couldn't necessarily bring students out into the community the way you used to. So they found ways to actually bring in real work. That whether it was maybe working with a manufacturer, having a manufacturing process brought in, or a quality check process. Because because these things are ultimately important. Making sure something meets a quality check. And again, depending on the ability of the student in question, sometimes it could be a task like verifying that a bottle cap operates correctly for prescription medication. Because if we're going to mail someone life-saving medication, that cap better stay on. And then just double checking all of those, or putting in those seals that we know that like that silver piece of paper, like doing that again and again with a tool. But that was real work that gets done for a living in all sorts of places, because you can have a machine do the most you want, but someone's better quality checking things that actually impact people's lives. And so, as you can imagine now that the lockdown phase of the pandemic has subsided and life has returned to normal in a lot of ways, they're really reopening all those arrangements to get students out into community-based instruction opportunities. And I think it's important to recognize that I think when we think about education, the first thing we think about, rightfully so, is educational outcomes, and then we think about professional outcomes. But there is a piece of this that's also about life skills and how to live our lives as independently as possible. And a lot of out-of-district placements, particularly APSSDs, focus on those sorts of things. So you do see schools that have miniature apartments that can actually teach the ability to make beds, to learn how to cook different meals. Things that might actually be a real skill. It was interesting on the tour I went, a lot of schools had horticulture programs. And one thing that really struck me when I was very early in this role is, this could be a job opportunity. They hire people to do this. But if it's not, maybe it's something that they just do because they like it. And then how else, and what's more of an experience than that? And getting the chance to actually try different things and figure out what you want for your own life. And that's that's the other thing to recognize. Some of these schools have they're all smaller than the traditional public school counterparts, in part because they need to be specialized and individualized. And some of the schools have as few as 16 students, some of them go up to several hundred. But again, it's about the needs of the students they're serving and the limitations and the opportunities the students bring to the table, but also those of our, the abilities of our specialists to meet those needs. Yeah, so
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for having me.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.